I visited the town of Frederick, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., and met a lot of people who were suffering or had family members who had died from rare illnesses. And one thing they all had in common was a theory that the source of these rare illnesses was a local army base called Fort Detrick and some of the secret activities that have been going on there for decades.
I lived on Elm Street, and on the side of the road that I lived on, just counting the 6 houses, everyone had cancer.
So my daughter, at the age of 28 years old, was diagnosed with brain cancer. Then my second daughter gets sick and has tumors in her womb, and they said that this was not genetic but environmental. About a year after that, my wife then gets renal cell carcinoma and dies a year later after that. We have over 1,300 documented cancer victims right now, just in a 1-mile radius. I'll be quite honest with you, it's changed my life so radically, sometimes I don't even know who I am.
1,300 people in a 1-mile radius. And what's causing so much sickness? It turns out all these victims have one thing in common. They live next to a military base called Fort Detrick.
In historic Frederick, Maryland, are the biological warfare laboratories. The volunteers have been positioned on the outside of the test sphere, in which a cloud of biological warfare agent can be generated.
In 2009, Fort Detrick was added to the EPA's Superfund priority list, making Area B, located here, one of the most polluted places in the nation, just across the street from this crowded neighborhood.
We don't drink our tap water.
Who told you that you couldn't drink?
Nobody said you're not allowed to, but it's kind of just a general, known thing in my neighborhood that we don't drink the tap water.
And why is that?
Because we know there's chemicals there.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. Sunday, November 17th, 2024. Thank you for joining me today. I know I said I was going to get in some foreign policy on the next show, and I absolutely will continue to cover all of these stories. As I was thinking before I was going live, I don't think I'll ever stop covering the story that exists around Israel and Palestine, because I don't think this will ever be a story that stops being relevant to what we're living through in the world today. I may be proven wrong with that. I hope I am, but I think that's where we are. My point is, that's not going to be what I discuss today. I pride myself over the years of trusting my gut, especially when it's something that I just can't get out of my, whether it's about the nanotechnology discussion we've had, which I still stand by that being way ahead of its time and something which we'll be looking to as we go further, possibly even in the next 4 years. But today, something stuck in my mind around the Dioxin conversation. One of many, as it seems there always are examples of fires. There's another recent fire in Bakersfield over the last week, California. And it's not that story in particular that made me dive into this today. It was really this, I just can't get this out, this deeper connective point to this story. Today, what we're going to cover is that story, the overlapping with Georgia, tie back to East Palestine, and a larger conversation around how I think this fits in with a lot of what's going on. Now, that's actually why I decided to start with that clip. That, as you remember, that's a clip that talks about Fort Detrick in not even really, even the documentary doesn't get in to provable specifics about let's say, what are the chemicals in the water or what is it exactly, but more so just the idea that the experimentation, whether that's with pathogens or just byproducts of the industrial or just the military uses, burn pits and whatever else we've talked, it's a very common thing to see around military bases that there's pollution like this. We don't hear that often, and there's obvious reasons for that. So think about that in a different context. Obviously, that was played around the COVID-19 conversation because Fort Detrick is a central BSL-4 lab where they work on things like coronaviruses and Ebola and many different. I think the statistic, if I remember correctly, was once, I'm going to say it wrong, I'm sure. Off the top of my head, it was something ridiculous. And this is coming directly from Fort Detrick information. It was something like once every, so like many, I don't want to misquote it, but you guys remember that with it, it was leaks or disasters or things that got let out somehow once every so many weeks for so many years straight. And I mean, it's mind blowing to think about when you're talking about high level things. BSO-4, if you remember the conversation during COVID-19, being the highest level lab they have working on the most dangerous pathogens or whatever you want to discuss them working on. And I think it's alarming to think that that happens so frequently. Even to the conversation around the anthrax and that the argument about how that happened and ultimately tying it back to the base itself, or the swine flu conversation. I play that clip often that ties back to Fort Dix, all these different conversations. Now that is important to consider. And I do think there's a relevant point around that. But what I'm pointing at today is just to consider it a different light. That we're talking about them knowingly, kind of almost in a casual conversation, they just don't drink the water around this base. Or what about just military bases? I'm willing to bet you if you look into the surrounding areas to a lot of these bases that you're going to find a lot of these byproducts. And so what we're going to focus on today is something that if you're following this platform, this channel, that we've talked about a lot. And that is the very, very obvious, unquestionable risk of dioxins and how it has been something that they've been highlighting, discussing how they're going to deal with it, the rising problem that just kind of vanished in the conversation. And there are some things that have been done, remediation, direction. But as I understand it, if you've been following along since East Palestine, which is really what opened my mind to this conversation, it's very clear that they got to a point where it became obvious that they don't really know how to deal with this. That even the incineration, which most is around, I think, 1,000 to 1,100 degrees, does not actually deal with dioxins. And there's arguments to say the highest we can get with these incinerators do not actually remove dioxins. Now, that's debated between different levels, but I'm going to show you today an interesting evolution of this conversation. We've talked about the CNN article from 1995, which I'll point to again today, but going to one before that, a conversation from 1994 and before, highlighting this weird debate that was going on between the New York Times and different, where all of a sudden, despite it being acknowledged this was a real problem that we all acknowledge as a risk that we have to deal with, suddenly you got mainstream articles that came out and said, wait a minute, it's not dangerous at all. Turns out it's just like sunbathing a little bit more. Now, we know for a fact that's not true today. And even the person that wrote those articles, and we'll go through all this, turns out they were sort of admitted that wasn't true. The bottom line is, where did that come from? As this is the point of the article we'll get to, they're going, where did that come from? Who either pressured or influenced the New York Times to put this out, to causing this debate going forward? Now, again, 1995, the expert speaking to CNN made it clear that this was hundreds of times the safe level in your food today, in the Big Macs and KFC you're eating, let alone the soil in your body, which is also part of this problem. But the point is that even then they were going, but the chlorine company said that it wasn't that dangerous, or we need to research it. We can't just blame one thing and remove all of them. And I can prove to you that since that point, this has only got worse. And I'll show you the studies that make that exact statement, that in the US and Europe, this problem has only gotten worse. And I'll show you an article we covered during East Palestine from Stephen Lesher from The Guardian, where he makes the explicit point, and this is the same thing I'm saying today, that the reason that they were refusing to test for dioxins, which I'm going to show you a statement from Scott C. Smith today, where I reached out to him this morning and asked him for any update on the studies. And the main thing he says is the EPA is refusing to test for dioxins, just like East Palestine. Now, why would that be? Knowing that, and I'll prove to you for the umpteenth time that EPA is aware of this, knowing that this is the most dangerous thing that will absolutely be a byproduct of exactly what they're dealing with, and yet not only not acknowledging it, not testing for it, not doing anything to keep people safe. Why is that? Again, Stephen Lesher making the point that this is because they know it's there, they know it's damn near ubiquitous, and they don't know what to do about it. Now, really think about what that means. If you're even just administrate, like, let's look at it from first a political dynamic. If you want to look at it like that, I tend to see them all as the government, but left-right kind of idea, where you change administrations. Now, whether it's left or right or just the government, you do change people in positions, right? So as the new people come in and the old people go out, you step into what the problem. So a new EPA head steps in and goes, okay, wait a minute, look at all this dangerous stuff. And it turns out we don't even know what to do about it. Now, are you going to jump in and go, guess what? Here's a huge problem you're all suffering from. You didn't even know, and I don't know what to do about it. Do you really think your government's going to do that? Now, I don't know I can't prove that's what's exactly happening. the logic of why. But I can prove the problem exists. I can prove they know about it. And I can prove that nobody is even choosing to bring it up when you know and they know it is the main problem what we're talking about. It's alarming to me. Now, the standing back point is, how does this interconnect with everything else? Because I've been really racking my brain about what this means. Is this something that's just a random byproduct, like I just kind of described, where they just don't know what to do and they're like a glyphosate, which again, I kind of see these things all interconnecting, but that maybe it's just a side thing they don't know what to do with and they don't want to take the brunt from letting you know they screwed you over. It's too bad. We don't know what to do. Now it's too late. And so now it's just your life. But I'm starting to see more and more how this interconnects with different things. Now, I'm not even talking about like a level 1 conversation about reaping the profit from creating illness that they can then, you know how that goes. Now, that's more abstract. We're talking about big pharma and different layers of government. It's not just the government, but deeper than that, even more so, talking about the way that this can be used for experimentation, for any number of different things. Now, where we're going to today is a clip that was shared with Shannon Joy and Catherine Austin Fitts, something she actually discussed in an interview we recently had in the studio, which is there is a conversation to be had about whether or not certain power structures are trying to subtly reduce the lifespan of the population for the interest of purely financial benefit, but also a lot darker conversations. Now, I'm not going to say that I think that's exactly what this is. Maybe one part of it, but I just wanted to throw out something new to the conversation for you to consider, knowing that we don't know exactly why this is being ignored. One of the many possibilities from somebody that I highly respect of why any number of these things might be happening, whether it is, and again, it doesn't have to be a deliberate, willful action to make this hurt people, but more so that it's something that has been allowed to get worse, to fester because of our corrupted system. And now it's going, okay, well, maybe we can lean into this. And we've seen the burning of food supply chain discussions of meat factories. There's all sorts of different things that tie around to this. But today is just the focus on these recent events and the dioxins themselves. And we're going to go over some studies that make it very clear that they know about it, that they know how seriously damaging this is, and that what it ultimately creates is a circumstance where nobody can really point a finger at anybody, where you end up with cancer and immune issues and deformities and all sorts of things that dramatically lead to the lessening of your lifespan and your children and your children's children. We're talking about a long-term lifespan, because realize in the body, the half-life is much longer in women, by the way, but 7 years or so for men. I think it was something like 17, or we'll get to it in the articles for women. But in the soil, it lasts decades. Half-life. Meaning that this stuff continues to be, and we've gone over the air transfer from the United States and Canada and North America into the Arctic Canada locations. And we're talking about long-term transition of these dioxins in the air, traveling thousands of miles, as even seen and acknowledged, and having a dangerous level in the breast milk of women in Arctic Canada. And we're not going to consider what that source that can make them suffer is doing to the people that live in the town next to it. I just don't know how it's possible we can't have these conversations unless this is being willfully covered up, and then you can decide why that might be. So let's go through all this information today, and hopefully this can trigger a conversation. More people can start talking about this and start holding their feet to the fire until more honest people that see the problem, but they have bigger things on their plate start going, okay, wait a minute, I'm at the lower rung of the EPA, and I can recognize this being ignored. Speak up, call it out. Acknowledge that this is not being dealt with, and acknowledge the long-term consequences of doing that. And even more so, if you know why that might be done, if it's more than just simple malfeasance, then say something. It's important that we start finding the courage to call these things out, because whether it's that your job is in this or that you're in a partisan side of this, people are willing, more than I've ever seen, to kind of ignore dangerous things right now because they think that it's somehow, I mean, really, we're like living in an embodiment of the lesser of evils dynamic. Everything everyone's doing is somehow like, well, it's bad, but this might be worse. So it just kills me how often that happens. Now, there's one more thing I'll say to start, and that is that one thing I keep seeing a lot of is that we see these problems, whether that's the vaccination conversation, whether that is the dioxin issue, whether that's glyphosate, whether that's any number of things, whether that's foreign policy, Zionism. That what's crazy is we've gotten to this weird kind of partisan dynamic, and I see it in this country more than anything, where we can point out a problem, objectively all agree that a problem is present. Yes, we see it, that's happening. And until somebody can go, well, here's the solution for it, it's as if we have to ignore the problem. And we all bump up against this. So we go, okay, well, this is an issue. Lesser of evils, for example, during the election. We all can acknowledge that doesn't really make sense. And they go, well, what do we do then? Well, you can decide. I'm not sure. And the point is that mindset becomes, oh, okay, well, then if there's nothing you can provide, then I'm going to go back to square one. And this is some sort of mental construct that I can't, I don't know, brainwashing. I don't understand how we can remove ourselves from the problem. And this is what I see in this kind of conversation, is that we're almost kind of overwhelmed with how much is going on that we don't want to address the problem. Step one is acknowledging it exists before we even begin to try to solve it. Just because someone does not have a solution to a problem being presented does not mean that you should disregard the problem. I think that sounds pretty simple and obvious, but it's happening a lot today. So before we get into everything else, actually, I think I showed this the other day. I can't remember. Either way, if I didn't, there's a new shirt on our Big Frog side of the clothing. We have a few things on the Big Frog and still some remnants on the Truth clothing before that goes away, which more will end up on this site. But we just added this one, which is Vincent Omnia Veritas, which means, I do remember now that I did bring this up, but truth conquers all things. And I think it's a just cool idea for, where we're going right now in the world. And I think it's almost like the, irritating objectivity, like the idea being that truth and principles and foundation, and holding true to that and not letting it waver based on anything else, I think is an important thing for today. So I'll include that link for you. Now, before we get into the main point, which is the only thing we're getting into today, is dioxins, I want to highlight something about fluoride that kind of overlaps with this. This was 2 days ago or 3 days ago. And it says, Winter Haven commissioners. So it just, this is in Florida. Is FLA, Florida? Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like I should know that, but I feel like FLA doesn't make sense. Anyway, there's some weird abbreviations in the states and everything else. But anyway, so the point is, in Winter Haven in Florida, commissioners vote to remove fluoride from water, citing RFK Jr. Now, first and foremost, guys, that's a good thing. Obviously, like no matter what else is going on, no matter whether this one thing is some massive scam to get you to believe everything else, which part of me thinks there's more to that than we know, it is still an objectively good thing that they're ultimately doing, whoever they cite, that they're recognizing that fluoride is dangerous, whether or not it's only because RFK said so or not, that they're choosing to remove it. This is a positive thing, even if it's on the back of something negative. And I just want to point that out, that this is something we should be very proud about. Not because RFK said so, whether or not he has good intentions, but because people like you are the reason this is being discussed. Not because RFK brought it up. It's because of people like Michael Conant and the Fluoride Action Network and people like Derek Brose and the long-term relentless effort over years and multiple reviews of the National Toxicology Program report, which has been there for a decade, but we know is dangerous. Remember, the main point that I was making in this discussion is the government has been fighting well more than a decade, but since this has been public, since the NTP has their report that says dangerous, your government from multiple agencies, pretty much all of them, CDC, EPA, FDA, they're fighting to maintain, to keep something that they know is a neurotoxin in your water. That's just earth-shattering. That should wake everybody up. There's no way to misunderstand that story. They're still, at this point, fighting to sort of maneuver to keep this in your water. Anyway, the point is you are responsible for this. Everybody out there that's been fighting to force corporate media, everybody else to acknowledge this story, that's a win for you. But the one thing that irks me about this is, remember, and again, that's why I kind of think that this is a government, this is just the opportunism of the government, which is usually how I chalk up most of the positive steps. I know I'm a pessimist when it comes to government. My point is that why wouldn't they, what does it take RFK Jr. saying this out loud for commissioners that have no better to do this? Which, whatever the reason, yes, I'm still saying that's a good thing regardless of why, but it frustrates me when you can have peer-reviewed science going back decades. These people are supposed to be looking at this stuff. They're not supposed to just blindly follow orders from their above, whether CDC or not. They're supposed to be making choices that are in the direction of the health for their constituents. So it's kind of frustrating that it takes RFK just saying it, or them citing him saying it, for them to acknowledge what has been transparently evident, which RFK points to for decades. You see my point in that? So it's kind of frustrating. This is the society we live in, where the actual facts are less important than an icon that says them. You see my point? And I think that's important that we try to change that. And I think we're all doing that. Either way, fantastic, important, and good news that people are beginning to make these changes. But so fluoride has been in your water your entire life, and it is a neurotoxin. Now, I'll cite the fluoride trial link that we have, that Derek has been just doing great work going back a year plus, more than that if you look at his conscious resistance as well. And this is the very last one. This is from September 26, 2024. Federal judge rules fluoride is a neurotoxin in historic lawsuit. Very simple. There's no misinformation there. It's very easy. The links are all in there for you. And there's a whole bunch going back where he's been covering this. I've been interviewing about it, going back a long way. So if you want to get caught up, I mean, so you can see down here, there are 5 pages of just this topic for the fluoride trial. Get caught up on what's been happening. At the very least, check out the last one so you know. And that's why it's happening. Even still, you've got ridiculous corporate media coming out there making fun of this like he's a conspiracy theorist. Like, obviously, we should get fluoride out of our water when we know that it's dangerous, or obviously we should be discussing the risks of vaccination that we know about and the obvious peer-reviewed science that show links to autism. Yes, this is all very easy and obvious, despite the ridiculous reflexive dismissal by people on CNN talking to Howard Lutnick. Vaccines don't cause autism. Great journalism, guys. Despite the fact that there is obviously a link, we can dispute. You get it. The point is, information is present that shows that we know these things are something to be discussed. I would argue much more than that, but just to make it objective for everybody. And these are all good things that are happening because of things he's saying, but we should already be doing this stuff because the evidence has been there. But speaking of fluoride in general, we're talking about something that has been put in your water and that is a neurotoxin. So consider this in the bigger discussion. So if we can recognize that the U.S. government has made conscious decisions to make it happen, which, remember, the joke, which is horrifying, is that if they weren't you putting it in your water, the people that who produce that, which is a byproduct of all sorts of things, industrial and otherwise, that they would have to pay to dispose of it. Instead, they get paid to put this in your water, or rather they buy it and put it in your water. That's wild to think about. So your government made a conscious choice to put something dangerous in your water, and you can get into, there's all sorts of conversations to have about the pineal gland and what it does to this and the deeper modulation of consciousness. These are not fake conversations, but they're deep for some people. The bottom line is that this is something you have to factor in when we're talking about the dioxin conversation. The willingness to ignore a problem, the willingness to use it against you. Now, it may be that they first thought fluoride was right for you. I don't think that. But in the context of today's story, the point is that it doesn't have to always be a planned long-term. It could be something that turned out to be something they discovered, realized they couldn't deal with it. And instead of being an honest entity and saying, we have a problem, let's get the best minds in the country to not, no, they just sweep it under the rug and kick it down to the next administration or however you want to look at it. Same thing. So there's a precedent right here for fluoride for why this is not that hard to wrap your mind around in allowing this to be such a problem that it's just, there's no going back. I make the point about glyphosate all the time. If you truly understand the depths, the breadth of what imagine the world being dipped in a vat of glyphosate. I mean, that's a little bit extreme, but that's where we are. There's no going back from what has happened, in my opinion, other than very long-term. I mean, because realize this stuff is in everything and that the studies are there. I've done many shows on this, and the clothes you're wearing and the air and the food you're eating. They did a urine test in the UK a while ago, and every one of them had glyphosate in their urine. They tested organic wines in Napa Valley, and every one of them had glyphosate. That's not organic anymore. But they just, of course, moved the needle so we can pretend they're still organic. This is the fake reality that we live in. So keeping all of this in mind, again, with the idea about the problem, right, where we're highlighting a very clear problem. So whether or not we can immediately decide how to solve that problem, we have to be clear that it's important to understand that it exists. Now, I'll include some of the recent conversations. Oh, it's weird. Forgot to line this up. For those in the podcast, doesn't matter. So this is the show from the 13th of October, Conyers, Georgia, Biolab fire. And remember, for those who don't remember, this is Biolab is the company's name, not necessarily a biological laboratory, at least as we're told. It makes mainly chlorinated products. The fire, as according to Scott C. Smith, could be the greatest dioxin disaster in history. Again, to wrap that up quickly, the point is that there were around 2 million pounds of chlorinated compounds that were burned in East Palestine. And to this day, that is an undeniable dioxin. Even the EPA was forced to acknowledge that after dragging their feet, barely wanting to test, refusing to test, until finally we got multiple independent tests showing dioxins were the issue there. The point is that in Conyers, Georgia, the low estimate is 12.5 million chlorine compounds, possibly over 20. That's why his point is it could be the worst. And he's still, as I spoke to him today, waiting for the test results from, I'm wondering why that's taking so long. Who knows? I don't know what he's getting it through, but I'm suspicious about how this is going because right in East Palestine, remember, they were being refused dioxin testing. One of the nurses on video even got caught saying that they were told they weren't allowed to give them. Something's going on here. And this adds to my point. Why would they not want you to test to find it? I'm willing to bet you not only because they would have been shockingly high, but because I bet you all of us have a problem with this. That's the thing I'm trying to talk about today. Now, this is the one I follow up on the 10th. Conyers, Georgia residents suffering prolonged illness. Now, this is from the 10th. This was a CNN article discussing how they were still dealing with these issues. The main thing that I highlighted was the chloracne overlap. The women, the people having rashes, the woman in this specific discussion had all of her legs were covered in rashes, and overlapping with the Seveso disaster, which is the Italy example of a dioxin release, which we'll get to in a minute. I believe that's right here. A look at 40 years of health and research and beyond. The Time magazine called this one of the top 10 environmental disasters in history to this day. And it's a dioxin disaster. That's what it was. You can read about it and we'll go over it in a second. And this, I argue, is less than what we're dealing with today. But that I'm not the expert. I'm waiting for the full results to come back on the exact amount, but we'll go through this and I'll show you what I mean. So this is still happening. And the point was the chloracne was what Seveso's study was basing it on. That when you have the acne that's based on chlorine, that is what they argue the definitive example of acute exposure. And people were studied 20, 40 years after this based on whether they had chloracne, and the ones that did, overwhelmed with problems. So we're seeing the same thing just like East Palestine. We spoke to many people that had chloracne. I'll also include this if you want to watch. It's an 8-minute clip. Grace is always doing amazing work. She goes over some of the interesting ins and outs of this. One of the points she brings out, actually, which I'm glad I just remembered, it's called Something Strange is Happening in Georgia. This is from the 2nd of October. She makes a point. I thought out loud about this in the last show I did around chlorine gas. If you remember, I just kind of thought out loud. I'm like, is chlorine gas the same? Is that just dioxins or is it something different? Now, she makes a good point about it. That apparently, and I looked it up more in depth after I did that show, chlorine gas is not the same. It's dioxins. As we talked about, dioxin is a byproduct of burning chlorinated products and specifically chlorine. But the chlorine gas is another weaponized version of using chlorine. The reason I brought that up in the past show was about whether or not what they were suffering from was because they kept calling it chlorine gas. My point is, I don't believe that's what this was. I believe they were referring to the byproducts of burning that chlorine. Because if it was chlorine gas, that would have been just the remnants of what didn't get burned in the massive fire. So I think they're conflating those two things. Anyway, she makes a good point about it in here in regard to what it was, how it's been used as a weapon. I'll also include this. It's an ongoing discussion from specifically Conyers, Georgia, about the shutting down the biolab company. Because if you remember, this has gone back decades. They've had, I think, 3 or 4, if I remember correctly, different fires because of this plant. And every time, I'm talking at least the 3 that I've just went into in depth and myself, every time they've had this, it's been the same company with the same exact problem. Remember, the issue here is that they have sprinkler systems with water over chemicals that chemically react with water. That's not a joke. This should be a criminal investigation for things just like that, but it doesn't seem to be going that way. And every time in the past, it's been the same thing. So either they do this on purpose, or they should be charged with such extreme incompetence, malfeasance, because they've allowed the sprinklers to remain. And it causes a chemical reaction, which causes a massive dioxin release. It's the same exact thing as the Seveso disaster in Italy. To me, just like the guy who died right after giving testimony as a whistleblower, he argued this was deliberate. He died right after giving testimony that this company was doing this. Now, here's what he said, what Scott C. Smith said to me when I asked him. I simply reached out and I said, what's the status of the upcoming reports? And what do you think about this current disaster as well that we're going to talk about? And he simply said, although I still don't have the dioxin results, this is important, from Georgia, he says the corrupt EPA, their playbook from East Palestine to Conyers, Georgia, is unfortunately alive and well, as the EPA has refused to test for dioxins and many other compounds like PAHs, which he mentioned, I'll read off what that is in a second, that are known to be generated when chlorine compounds burn. Now, it's one of the main things I'm going to get into in the studies right after this, that they know this. There's no arguing. I mean, other than a shocking level of incompetence, which might even make sense with the continual downgrade of the lesser of evils game that gets dumber and dumber people in power, which then they appoint worse and worse people. Maybe. Either way, it's their responsibility. And the point is that they know that burning chlorinated products, let alone chlorine itself, which is what the biolab location had, chlorine specifically, and other chlorinated products on plastic pallets full of plastic. I mean, this is like a dioxin perfect storm. And that they're refusing to test for them. Why would that be? I mean, I think that point alone makes this clear. This is my opinion, but think about this. If they know that, which I can prove they do, it's easy to see, why would they refuse to test it? Why, when East Palestine, would they drag their feet for months until finally, due to even corporate media asking about dioxins in the press conferences, that they were forced to acknowledge it? That sounds to me like they're doing everything to avoid even talking about what they know is there. Doesn't that sound like a problem that they know they can't handle or that they want there? To me, it does. Now, here is the PAH. It's chlorinated polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbons. And this is what's important. It's another aspect of the same problem, which is that if you look at the health concerns, they're chlorinated, first of all. So when those are the byproducts as well, but even if those were burned, that would create dioxins. And it says have been linked to potential health hazards, including mutagenicity and carcinogenicity. Right. So we're going to get into how the obvious, one of the big issues with this is these are endocrine disrupting chemicals as well as carcinogenic. And it says toxicity to aquatic organisms and humans, bioaccumulation and biomagnification in food chains. That's a huge part of this because these are PAHs. This is less dangerous objectively than dioxin, specifically TCDD, which is the most dangerous chemical anywhere. Now, the point is that this is also accumulating in the food supply and the soil. How long has that been happening? Longer than you know. Now, here's a clip of play because I want to set this in your mind. Now, the High Impact Flick shared this saying, take 4 minutes to watch this and be sure to follow Shannon Joy Radio. I agree. This is a true slice of independent journalism. Now, a Sense Receptor shared this, tagging DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, or whatever you want to call this weird thing, however that works out. Apparently co-headed by 2 people, which seems embarrassing to me. But either way, the point is that she's highlighting if they really want to care about this efficiency conversation, we should be discussing the trillions of dollars that are missing, which I doubt they will. But the point she makes in this is really interesting about, and this is the same thing one of the points, many that she makes in this excellent interview we had in studio on September 8th, see beyond the duopoly and take responsibility for a future, which she discusses the interesting point about whether they might be trying to lower the lifespan of the average person. One, on the surface for a financial, like basically, I'll let her explain it better than I will, but the idea of tapping into all of the, which is why people tell you your Social Security won't be there, all these different retirement elements that they're just tapping into for all sorts of things. And if they can lower that lifespan, well, there's more to tap into there. But I argue there's much more going on here. But I'll let her speak for herself.
Really wanted to reform the deep state, I'd say, okay, who's got the 21 trillion and how do we get it back?
Can you explain that 21 trillion if you can?
Yeah. So the Department of Defense in 1995, we had a budget, we had a big budget confrontation, and it was later described to me by the head of the largest pension fund in the country. He said, they've given up on the country. They're moving all the money out starting in the fall. And that was the beginning of the financial coup. And in fiscal 1998, HUD was missing $59 billion in the first year. And then by 9/11, the federal government, mostly DOD, was missing approximately $4 trillion. Okay? And then when 9/11 happened, the day before 9/11, Donna Rumsfeld got up and confessed that DOD was missing $2.3 trillion.
Unbelievable.
Okay. And then 9/11 happened and everybody sort of forgot about the missing money. And so Larry kept publishing it. And I kept saying, we've got to pay attention to the missing money because essentially most of this is being financed out of our pension funds and retirement funds.
Jeez.
And if we don't address this, we won't have enough money to meet our obligations under the retirement system unless we lower life expectancy. And in fact, a lot of the great poisoning started at the same time. And if you look at U.S. life expectancy.
Just so it's clear, because she says it very fast, she talks about the great poisoning. I think that's important. Because guys, this it's not just dioxins, but this is the point I'm focusing on for today's show. But you guys are well aware of all the rest of the conversations that her and I have had, that she's had with many other people, that she's had on her own shows, the conversations about the many different ways we are being, and you don't have to feel that it's being deliberately poisoned, but that nonetheless is the byproduct of it. I do agree with her. I think it's deliberate about whether we're talking about our endocrine disrupting chemicals or glyphosate or PFAS or any number of the things that are deliberately, I think, adding to exactly what she's discussing that lead to reproductive issues, immune problems, which then are also catalysts for the other things that we've discussed.
When the financial coup started, life expectancy started to fall and diverge with the other 19 top industrial countries, and that accelerated with the pandemic. And what we are watching is a systematic lowering of life expectancies, which is part of dealing with this financial problem. So.
So the surface point is that simply that they have a financial issue and that they find by lowering your life expectancy that they can reap the benefits financially, which will fill that gap. I mean, that's pretty logical, right? That's how anybody, well, other than the idea that they wouldn't be willing to lower your lifespan in a slow, steady way that nobody would notice. I mean, really, I know that sounds sinister because it is, but there are wars conducted there are silent wars happening all over the world. We know our governments in general are very capable of this. I also just think it's much deeper than that. But just recognize that should be a point that's not hard to digest. We have plenty of precedent that the U.S. government alone is absolutely capable of that, especially to foreign governments, but more to foreign populations, but provably to you as well.
If you can't balance the books with full funding, you balance the books by lowering the drain that the population is taking out of the retirement system. So this is part and parcel of our financial situation. Now, you have not seen the new or the incoming administration talk about the money that's missing from the federal government. If that money went missing, guess.
And I don't think they will, by the way.
Where it went missing. Who runs the federal bank account?
Federal Reserve. I don't know. I mean,
the New York Fed.
Okay, so yeah, it is a division of the Federal Reserve, right?
So if 21 trillion is missing from federal accounts, then the New York Fed implemented those transactions.
And remember, the Fed is not a part of the federal government. They call it that. I argue, which is not hard to wrap your mind around, in order to manipulate people into thinking that. It's a separate entity, guys. And that's where you get into this whole conversation about Trump firing Powell. And I've already seen, I think it was it Mike Rogers? I forget. Somebody was out there, I think deliberately trying to convince you without saying it that it was part of the government, rather under the control of the executive branch. Now, you could make an argument that would be the case even if it wasn't part of the government. But my point is the way they were describing it was trying to keep you thinking that's a very nefarious agenda. I just think we need to realize, whether by accident or not, if I want to give you that bone, that we're going in the same direction.
Right.
Little New York State, right?
Right. Well, it's very funny. When Bobby Ann Cox told me about her litigation, I said, Bobby, that has nothing to do with health. That has to do with, you're the New York Fed, and you need to make sure that every financial person and hedge fund manager does what you tell them to do. And if they don't, you need to be able to kidnap them.
Is this why New York is so corrupt? I'm in New York. Is this why New York is so corrupt, Catherine?
New York needs to assert complete control of any individual that they need to implement the financial system.
Now, it shouldn't be hard to see the overlap of the influence of Israel in New York, but that shouldn't be the only point, if at all. These points are relevant regardless of that. But I think with how relevant that is to the global conversation, it's, what's funny is people almost, at least more, it used to be more so, would shy away from ever highlighting connections to Israel because you're called racist. But the point is, we can all hopefully clearly see there's a far, far more going on that has anything to do with Jews or Christians that has to do with what Israel's trying to do around the world.
That's what that health regulation is about. Jeez. You need to be able to kidnap and, no, you can't afford for one hedge fund manager to implode the entire international financial system, right?
No, you can't. That's wild.
Right. Do you really want a hedge fund manager, standing up and on the Solari show or the Shannon Joy show and talking about how, they've just laundered out another $1 trillion through the BIS and they're stealing it? Really?
That's wild.
Right.
So check out this interview we did, or any others we've had, because she gets into something like this, and here we go. It's fascinating, and she's got a lot of interesting insight. Either way, the larger point to bring this into today is the question of whether or not that might be part of what's happening. And really, this addresses the larger, as she's saying, the great poisoning, not just dioxins. But I can't stop seeing how this overlaps with a lot of different things. Let's not forget that dioxins in the past have been used by the U.S. government to try to assassinate a foreign president. That's on the record. It was used with Agent Orange. They pretend like it was a byproduct, but it was not. I believe it was a chemical weapon that was used. And I don't think that's I think that's pretty obvious when you look at the information. That this has been something that's been used. So this goes back as far as you can look where they know this. So it's also not hard to start thinking that this was a slow, deliberate effort for exactly what she's talking about. But you can decide for yourselves. All I want you to recognize today is that it is a problem, that it exists, that it's pretty damn ubiquitous, and that they're not doing anything about it. Everything else on top of that is just for further investigation and discussion. So let's start with this recent one in Bakersfield, California. This is from November 9th. Now, this is just to quickly point out, and this is what the image from today. Multiple fire departments raced to smother the flames of a massive fire that erupted in Southeast Bakersfield warehouse Saturday morning. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be something, it could be random, organic, could happen. The point is how clear the byproduct is of any of these. And I'm going to prove it to you yet again with what burned in here, and you'll never hear them addressed. I mean, think about it like in either context where you have something that you know is super dangerous, a cyanide plant or whatever. And suddenly, there's a big, massive release at the plant. They rush in and they go, don't worry, we're checking for asbestos. Well, what about the cyanide? We're checking for asbestos and VOCs. That's what Scott C's pointing to. We're going, well, what the hell? What about the thing you know is the most dangerous chemical in the world that you know, as a matter of fact, will be a for certain byproduct of what we just know burned? What? Like with East Palestine, almost like even what dioxin, like they weren't even sure, acting like they didn't even, and maybe they didn't, at least at the person with the podium. But we know for a fact that this is something that they're willfully disregarding because of the evidence that's at hand. So down here it says, first, business in the area was able to continue as usual. This is the point that really kills me. The same thing that happened with Conyers, Georgia. Even dioxins aside, with what we're talking about, that's a good point that Grace makes in her video, just chlorine. That she references the overlap to the chlorine bombs used in war, and that's a chemical weapon. That's an attack, right? So even if it was an accident, which I don't believe it was, you're telling people to shelter in place when there was basically the equivalent of a chemical weapons attack? That doesn't make any sense. So in this case, the same thing. We made sure business as usual before we even addressed what was going on. I mean, with all the examples we have, that seems pretty crazy to me, but I'm continually not surprised by the shocking ineptitude of government these days. But here's another article from the 9th, this Bakersfield, California. This is from the Bakersfield.com or Bakersfield, Californian. Black smoke from two warehouse fire visible for miles. Look at that. So here's the main points. Two warehouses of about 10,000 square feet. They're packed from floor to ceiling with plastic drip irrigation material that produced the, quote, ominous looking column of smoke. Now, obviously, as Scott would point out, the black smoke is that's the unburned material. That is what is the one of the necessary parts to truly make the dioxin problem the worst, as well as just chlorinated products, plastic being one of them. Specifically, the things that we can discuss in this. So they're talking about plastic drip irrigation material. Now, I looked into what they would have, and one of the main things we're discussing is black plastic mulch, which is which is one of the things that we're discussing burned in these plants. Obviously, burning black plastic mulch can release dioxins, which I shouldn't need to. Anything plastic, for the most part, is going to have these problems. But specifically, one of the things with plastic drip irrigation material is black plastic mulch. And yes, that is one of the obvious issues. Exposure to dioxins have been linked with various health issues we'll get into in a minute. On top of that, plastic drip irrigation material, which is black, and that's right there. Oh, I think I was out of order. Black plastic mulch is widely accepted for the ability to warm the soil. These are all what you would find. Drip tubes, drip lines made of plastic and designed to deliver water. Those are plastic, which will obviously cause that. And then mats and plastic mulch and all these things are the same conversation. I just want to make sure that was clear. That is what we're discussing. So in a review, in searching for these exact materials, specifically plastic drip irrigation material, it led me to this study from 2022. A review of soil contamination with dioxins and biodegradation technologies. Now, one thing they highlight in here, the main point of the article, the study, is to highlight the efforts to clean, right? But what you could do to degrade the dioxin. Now, the point is obviously you'll find the same thing we're talking about, that it seems to be damn near impossible. But I wanted to go over some of the most important things that stood out to me in this. Now, if you're new to this conversation, this will probably shock you because dioxins are, again, TCDD being the most dangerous, is the most dangerous chemical in existence, according to all the experts. Dioxins, that it writes, are dangerous threat agents, even at low concentrations, 1 part per billion, which are enough to wreak havoc on human health and the environment. Now, remember the numbers because we're going to go through all of these examples. Now, some of these are kind of up in the air or we're using different comparative methods. Either way, it gives you kind of a general sense of what we're talking about. The point, even at very low concentrations. Now, in humans, dioxin exposure in humans affects the endocrine glands and reproductive functions. And we're going to show you some of these studies, even very, very low amounts in past studies have shown very clear side effects. And the point then is that you have side effects, then it stays in your body and you pass this down the line. Causes diseases in the central and peripheral areas of the nervous system and impedes fetal development, especially in the nervous system and joints. Dioxins can remain in the environment for a long time, seeping deeply into soil and sediments. Therefore, dioxins remaining in the soil and sediments will seep into water sources and ecosystems, including those that produce fish, shrimp, vegetables, crops, posing a risk of poisoning for future generations. This is 2022. Now, we're going to come back to this at the end, but I want to remind you from East Palestine, and I'm willing to bet you it's even more than this, but this is what they admitted after the fact. This article came out in 2024. East Palestine, which was what, 2020, what was the exact, give me the exact date in the chat if you remember, years ago. We're talking about something that we called when it happened. We were talking about the reality of when it was happening, that we knew that this was going much further because of the smoke, because of and of course we got pushed back on. Conspiracy theorists, alarmists. The point is, they've then later in June of 2024 admitted chemicals, the one we know for sure that even they had to admit, which was the highest problem, the dioxins, which by the way, we'll show you again in a minute, travel thousands of miles. When dioxins become airborne, they travel thousands of miles. We knew this then, as they did too. This is from 1995. The point was, spread to 16 states, dioxins and whatever else, 16 states across. Remember, they had a couple mile radius. They shut it down real quick. How did Ryan Cristian know? How did Scott C. Smith know? Because Scott is an expert. I looked at their work because we care, we research. Your government chose to hide this from you. So in this context today, where were we here? Here we go. Let's recognize that this, whether any of these, is going very, very far. It is landing in the ground. And the point was all of the sediment and all of the burned ash was landing 16 states across. That ends up in the soil, in the sediment, in the water, in the food. It's not a joke. It's very easy to prove. And that doesn't go away. Now it says there are many studies on airborne and food dioxins as the main sources in different countries, but there are not many general reports on dioxin-contaminated soil, especially for the bioremediation of dioxins in soil. You know why? Because they don't know how to deal with this. So ultimately, they're not even trying to look into it because we don't know. So we don't need more evidence showing us that we caused a problem that we can't solve. Or maybe it's deeper than that. Now it says, depending on the number of chlorine atoms, this is the point. Actually, I'll grab that study too. I forgot to grab that one. And this is something that's very easy to prove, but in case you wanted to see, it's a study from 2020, or was it, let me see, 2001, excuse me, about specifically chlorine combustion and dioxins. And the point simply being that since every molecule of dioxin contains 2 or more atoms of chlorine, chlorine is a necessity for dioxin formation. Therefore, when no chlorine is present, no dioxins are formed. Chlorine being the central dynamic in all of this. Remember, in Georgia, it literally was chlorine that burned, not chlorine oxide or vinyl chloride, but just chlorine on plastic pallets. So like the perfect storm is the point. Which is why Scott himself said that this could be the biggest disaster dioxin related in history. So that they're saying here, depending on the number of chlorine atoms is ultimately the dependent on what gets worse, all the way to the top example, which is TCDD. Interestingly, in case you find this interesting as well, it points to the idea being that they are highly toxic because specifically they have chlorine atoms at positions 2, 3, 7, and 8. That's why 2378 TCDD is the general term for the most dangerous dioxin formation and just the most dangerous chemical we know of. Studies have shown, it says, that the emissions of dioxins in the environment is mainly caused by humans. So it's not, they love to point to, like, for example, volcanoes release dioxins. There are natural examples, but the vast majority, according to every study I've seen, is because of burn pits, because of incineration, because of military activity. And we'll go over that in a second. I think some of them show right here. That's human action. And it's not because of Joe with his trash can. It's because of government stuff. Now, they add to it backyard burn pits. The EPA has all sorts of data about why backyard burn pits are the dioxin problem. But when it comes to anything central to the government or business, weirdly, they forget what dioxins even mean. That's the main thing here. But it says studies have shown that the emissions of dioxins in the environment is mainly caused by humans. The main anthropogenic origins of dioxins are classified into three sources: incineration, combustion, and industrial processes. All high-level corporate government overlaps. The World Health Organization has recommended in 2005 that the standard exposure levels of dioxins as 1 to 4 pictograms, TEQ being the toxic equivalency factor, per kilogram of body weight per 1 day. Now, just remember, now the thing is, there's also using different measurements from kilogram or pictogram, or, or rather specifically, it would be parts per billion, parts per trillion. The point is, generally speaking, we're talking about, at least the WHO saying, 1 to 4 pictograms toxicity equivalency per kilogram of body weight per day, or 0.07 parts per trillion in the blood. Think about that. 0.07 parts per trillion just ending up in your blood. Now, let's be very clear. What was happening in East Palestine was more than that. They were, I mean, we can show you the examples of, for example, where was the one right here of Scott finding specifically in the filters and homes well past when this happened in East Palestine. This is on July 2nd, up to 14,000% more dioxins in their filters in their homes than compared to a control somewhere else. So let's be very clear that we're talking about the obvious reality that there was more than this in there. The reason this was a problem, or even compared, as we'll get to in a minute, in the Seveso disaster, still arguably one of, according to Time Magazine, one of the top 10 environmental disasters in the world. Now, it says the general environmental limit in most countries is 1,200 parts per trillion toxicology equivalent in soil and 150 parts per trillion in sediment. So just think about that overlap and keep these numbers in your mind as we go into the next ones, because the reality is, I'm pretty sure we're dealing with much higher levels with what we're discussing today. Now, again, these are my opinions. I'm not, I always, we should wait for the studies coming from people like Scott or other independent experts. Sadly, we're getting far less attention on the Georgia discussion. In East Palestine, there was Texas A&M, multiple, independent experts were there. I believe Stephen Lesher was even one of them, if I remember correctly. But the point is that less people are paying attention to this one. And this one seems to be objectively larger. Dioxins, it says, as a dangerous threat agent to the environment and humans, are associated with severe damage to human health, shortening the lives of those exposed and potentially shortening the lives of their children and future generations. So to Catherine's point, and the larger point of why I think this, if it is deliberate, is a well-planned effort, because it's not easily identified. Other than the chloracne, which that's only acute exposure, you don't need the acute exposure to have the diminishing of your lifespan or cancers or whatever that happen decade later and no one knows what you don't notice it. You may have some nausea or you feel a little bit sick that day, and then suddenly years later you have cancer and you have immune system problems and you can't have a child. That's what this is causing. So if they wanted to pick something where it would be impossible to identify, well, they nailed it. But it says when dioxin levels in humans exceed the allowable threshold of 0.0064 pictograms per kilogram of the human body, think about how small that is. Dark patches of skin appear quickly as a result of cell death, mutated pigment cells, and impaired liver and kidney function. Guys, we've seen provable examples of chloracne, of that woman, exactly what we're talking about in the last show we did. In fact, this man's wife right here in this show, showing you this wild rash all over her body. We've shown you the chloracne conversation from East Palestine. So they're saying when it exceeds 0.0064 pictograms per kilogram of human body weight, that you get that response. And they're referencing the chloracne for the acute exposure for the historic examples. I mean, I think this all pretty obviously adds up that we're dealing with something serious here. And it says, if long-term exposure to levels exceeds the threshold, dioxins will affect the immune system, endocrine glands, and reproductive functions, leading to some cancers, diseases of the central and peripheral nervous systems, thyroid disorders, immune system damage, and endometriosis, which is a condition resulting from the appearance of endometrial tissue outside the uterus and causing pelvic pain, diabetes, etc. I mean, all of these things interestingly overlap with, I mean, you could overlap them with the COVID-19 shot, side byproducts. You could overlap with it with other endocrine disrupting chemicals. I mean, this is like a perfect storm for exactly what we're discussing, whether it's shortening the lifespan or just causing illness that can reap benefits for big pharma. And you can decide what you think makes the most sense. I just want people to acknowledge this is happening, right? Acknowledge the problem so we can actually solve this. Now it says, as a result, children of exposed parents were born with many tragic deformities. So think about that. So you're in East Palestine or anywhere else we're talking about this, and you got exposed. The potential reality is you may already be suffering from these problems. And that's one of the reasons why I think they didn't want you to be able to take a test to show you had dioxins in your blood right after the problem. Because you do it today, well, they're going to pretend, well, we don't know. There's a background level. You may have gotten it from that volcano, whatever, or that burning plant next to your house. The problem is that when they kick it down the road, it becomes very difficult to connect to what just happened. So let me reiterate that in case you missed the earlier point. There's multiple videos that we've showed in the shows right there that I just left for you, the links, of people in their hospital speaking to somebody and the nurse saying, they were told not to give these tests, even though they were being told by the EPA to go get them. There's an issue there, obviously. And having the children of the parents exposed, having tragic deformities. Some children lived in a vegetative state from birth. Now, we talk about things like autism and all sorts of other things that are like, was it the sudden infant death syndrome, which are, or really just is a category for we don't know what happened. And that's the truth of that. You look it up, it's just a catch-all for what we don't know why. We don't know why they died. And yet they diagnose that. This whole system is so broken. So vegetative state from birth, of course, the idea is it never gets related to things that don't want to talk about, like vaccination, for example. The association between dioxins exposure and 5 diseases, such as soft tissue cancer, benign lymphoma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, hairy leukemia cancer, and crolosis was also noted. Some diseases associated with dioxin exposure, such as acute, chronic, and subacute peripheral neuropathy, chlorosis, type 2 diabetes, liver cancer, lipid metabolism disorders, reproductive abnormalities, and birth defects, such as cleft lip and palate. See, these things they would never associate with this. Congenital malformities of the legs, hydrocephalus, neural tube defects, adhesions, sticky fingers or toes. I don't even know what that means. Muscle malformations and paralysis have also been observed as direct byproducts of dioxin exposure. None of those things are related with you see these things happen. They just go, that's just part of life. Probably not. What I think is interesting, the thought about so we're going to point out, as we have many times, about the fat accumulation. So ultimately 7-year for men, I forget we'll get to it in a second. I think it's 17 or higher for women. That's the half-life in your body. But it's interesting that they seem to focus on lipids. And I just thought that was an interesting overlap because this could be something else going on around any number of things where lipids are used in previous conversations. But it says the half-life of dioxins in the soil is from 60 to 80 years. Think about that. The half-life. So if this, like with East Palestine, 16 states across, that means that it is in the soil for 60 to 80 years is the half-life. I don't know. That's exactly why I don't think people want to acknowledge this. And it says, and at the same time, it persists for a long time in the environment, seeps into the soil and sediments, and migrates into vegetation and aquatic life, leading to bioaccumulation in the soil, in the food chain, and in your body when you consume those things. Environmental pollution, it goes on in general, and dioxin pollution in the soil in particular are markedly on the rise. This is in 2022. So as we'll go through again and go back to the earlier points where they're discussing in 1995 about why this is such a big problem, And my point is that they didn't do anything. Well, we can see that. Despite the conversations of the small actions of potentially bioremediation of certain locations, the point is the regulations, whether again, this is a good point to make about like the Elon Musk and removing regulations. I'm of the mind that we don't need a state in general, because I would argue if the state didn't exist, things like this wouldn't exist. You think the biolab plant's going to last very long in that county when the state's not protecting them? The people would have run them out of town. My point is that with no state, there wouldn't be regulation. But that was a point I just made. But if you're going to have a state, which obviously we will under Trump's administration, but then remove the regulation from business, all you're doing is this. You're allowing these businesses to do whatever they want, like they kind of already are, but now there's not even a semblance of or an illusion of accountability or enforcement. I think that's an important point to make. So as we can see, whether or not they're taking small actions here and there, it's continually increased, on the rise, markedly. And it says the main sources of dioxin emissions are industrial activities, such as combustion. Now it says dioxin emissions from G20 industrial activities account for more than 80% of the estimated annual emissions. Don't you love that? So all these high-minded countries out there preaching to the rest of the world about how they have to save the planet are 80% of release of the most dangerous thing we know about. Weird, Heather, we don't talk about that, right? Because it's all a big scam. Now, we are clearly destroying this planet in 100 different ways, but it's more than not the people pointing at everybody else that are doing it. And not with carbon. This is about all the other things we're dealing with, but I think it kills me that we're talking about specifically these countries that are 80% of the emissions of what is causing a lot of these problems. According to Miguel Dupico and Alberto Gomez, a study from 2015, annual global dioxin emissions were 17,226 kilograms, equivalent to 287 kilograms of the toxic equivalency. So we're talking about 0.007 parts per trillion in the blood. I think it's very important to think about. And it says the main sources of dioxins in the soil environment are fuel combustion. And by the way, I'm of the mind that it's much, much more than that, quite frankly, but that's the point is for you to decide. The main sources of dioxins in the soil environment are fuel combustion, metal production, pesticide production and use, of course, waste incineration, accidental fires, landfill disposal, combustion, and herbicide runoff in agricultural uses. So every single one of those things, I would argue we could build a world where that's not necessary, not in the way they're doing them. But of course, when that's a whole conversation. But obviously, all of these things we've discussed in their own right as problematic, because all of them are being done in ways that aren't considerate of whether they're actually causing a bigger problem. And frankly, I think a lot of cases doing it on purpose. Like, for example, in East Palestine, the landfill disposal, that was the reason these things got spread across these states, other than the fire itself, because they shipped them across country. And ultimately, and there was even the example of the dump truck that spilled on the way. Remember that? It dumped all the contaminated soil all over this area. That was chock full of dioxins and PFAS, we highlighted at the time, neither of which they could deal with, but didn't care. They shipped it across other states and buried it, or tried to burn it in one of the locations, which we could prove then wasn't even hot enough. I called them on the phone. I talked to them. Of course, that doesn't get any good coverage because that's real journalism, guys. We're going to talk anyway. The point is that shit in any other real world, that kind of conversation where I have on the phone evidence of them admitting they couldn't deal with what we knew was there, that should have been a bombshell. But of course, not TLAV. Dioxin concentrations have not decreased in Europe in recent years, but instead have increased significantly due to new dioxin emission sources. So not only, and this is my point about that, are they not really doing anything to stop what's there? There's more emission sources popping up every day. So not only are they trying to hide the problem they created, they're not even trying to stop it continually growing. And this is Europe, but the same thing's happening in the United States. That is crazy to me because of how clearly we can see what this is doing. Now, it says similar to the results of searching for research documents on the situation of dioxin pollution in the soils of European countries. There are few data on the situation of soil research in America in recent years. Gee, I wonder why. In general, across the United States, dioxin concentrations in urban soil are generally higher than in rural, which makes sense because more out in the open, there's less sources of this, which shows you that it's not backyard burn pits, it is government processes with maximum concentrations reaching 186 ng per kilogram, according to the toxic equivalency in urban areas. And it says the main source of dioxin-contaminated soil in industrial production activities is industrial production activities, followed by the consequences of war. Well, look at that. Producing high dioxin concentrations and widespread infection. Of course, one of the main reasons they don't want to highlight the problem is because, well, we can't stop the war state. Otherwise, this country would collapse, or specifically, the government would collapse. Maybe we should want that. How about we should want that? The point is that this is another clear example of something they will never decouple from. Sort of like we talked about the ESG thing, which none of us should want to support because of how clearly corrupt it is. Even the idea that we should act. Anyway, no. The point is they tried to pretend like, no, we nuclear power, or rather nuclear weapons or oil use or whatever else are ESG compliant because we use them to fight for freedom. And so it showed you that even their game, they didn't even apply it to themselves because they just gave themselves a pass because we use those bad things to fight for freedom. So it's a net positive. It's like just absolutely ridiculous. The point is that war being a leading cause of these releases makes perfect sense why they wouldn't want to address it. You have to understand, like I've said many times, this government runs on the blood of other nations. And that's not what American people want, hardly. But that is the way it is. And if the war state goes away, this country is propped up by that ongoing merchant of death. I mean, everything we've talked about around the world. Ultimately, it says current knowledge is insufficient to achieve an optimal set of values for the treatment of soils contaminated with dioxins on a laboratory scale, pilot scale, and field scale. So end point, we don't have enough information. Why? Because they refuse to look into this. And studies like this are left going, this is a big deal and we don't know what to do about it, which is exactly my point. Now, the Seveso disaster, only a couple points I want to make. Make sure you read through this because it's crazy. And this study was done in 2018. Okay, so look at 40 years of health research. So again, they went back to what Time Magazine still calls one of the top 10 environmental disasters in history, and it was specifically a dioxin disaster. That's what it's called, even on Time Magazine. Dioxin is a known carcinogen. The point is, just like before, there was a chemical reaction that caused this chemical to release massive dioxins. And people got chloracne. There was all sorts of terrible. The point is they looked at it 40 years away and said the people who had chloracne are the ones that had acute exposure. They mapped out what they looked at, what they dealt with, and compared it to those that didn't have chloracne. And the results were shocking. And the point is you can look through what we talked about in the last show about immune suppression, basically everything we just read off in that study. Now, in this location, it was an estimated 15 to 30 kilograms of TCDD over an 18-kilometer squared area. Now, look at what we just talked about, and especially with Scott telling us that we're talking about a minimum 12.5 million chlorinated compounds in Georgia. Now, I know we're kind of going back at the Bakersfield point was just to highlight another example of more of these fires that I can prove to you are at some level releasing dioxins. The Georgia example I'm worried about because of how large it seems. So if we know all the numbers we just went through, and this in what is still regarded as one of the top 10 environmental disasters, they had an estimated 15 to 30 kilograms, that's it, of dioxin TCDD over an 18-kilometer squared area. And today we can't acknowledge that these objectively larger disasters are, you see the point? That's either we have completely lost ourselves over the many lesser of evil cycles, or we are being lied to deliberately, possibly both. The other point, it says the TCDD level, and this is again going back to Seveso from 1979, I believe, remember correctly? Yeah, 1976. Now, as it says, the TCDD level, that's the worst, most dangerous thing in the world, dioxin, in blood, averaged 20.2 parts per trillion. And the levels of other dioxin-like compounds averaged 80.2 parts per trillion, resulting in an average total dioxin equivalency of 100.4 parts per trillion. So we're talking about, and this I think was, make sure I'm not getting the timing. I think that was in there. So I make sure I was going to say this was 20 years after, unless I'm misremembering from the other post. So it says the samples collected in 1976 from female residents. The levels, okay, so it's at the time. I think there's one coming up. I think it's in the future. So just thinking about the comparative point, 20.2. So again, coming back to this, only 15 to 30 kilograms over an 18 kilometer squared area. That's all with how many we already show were released in these past examples. And they're saying that back then, right after that, with a lesser amount, they had 20.2 parts per trillion of other dioxin-like compounds, an average of 80.2. And the total equivalency was 100.4 parts per trillion. I mean, guys, I think this is pretty objectively obvious. Down here, it says also TCDD levels were measured in serum and blood collected almost 20 years. Okay, that's what it was. 20 years after the accident. For 62 different people, the geometrics average blood TCD levels were significantly higher in women. And this is the point I was going to make right here. Look at this. 20 years later. And they have 17.6 part per trillion for women and 6.7 parts per trillion than men in their blood. So you realize right there, that's higher, shockingly higher than what people are supposed to have safe level from the WHO in a general sense. And this is 20 years later. And this is, I think, objectively smaller than what we're dealing with over here. But remember, these people didn't drop dead. They were the ones that went on to have reproductive issues, deformities, immune suppression, cancers, because that's what we're really talking about. So here is just an article from May 2020. 5 facts about dioxins, one of the most toxic compounds on Earth. And the reason they frame it like that is because there's a scale, TCDD being the most at the top. But that's the point. That one is the most. The rest of them are some of the most in the world. And you can read through this. I just want to include it for you to check out the fact that this is just a public and known discussion that yet people don't care about, or some in the government don't care, most anyway. Now, this goes back to 1994. The Truth About Dioxin, National Wildlife Federation. Now, this is an important post because what he's highlighting here, or she, Vicky Monks, is highlighting here, is the back and forth about this. So let's be clear. Right now, it's not up for debate. Even from the government, the reality is dioxins are shockingly dangerous. Specifically, that one we keep mentioning, TCDD. So keeping that in mind, at this point, 1994, a year before that CNN article, they're talking about how the New York Times will start trying to muddy the waters. Feels like they were serving the same purpose back then. Coming out trying to go, no worry, it's no worse than sunbathing. And the point they make in here is, where'd that come from? Clearly, we now know that's not true. And even in the article, it turns out that they later kind of admitted that. So where did that come from? I think my point here is that it shows you all the way back then, there was an effort to try to ignore that. Now that could have just come from the companies that were making chlorinated products. That's certainly possible. But consider however you look at it, they were talking about an effort through the New York Times and other media platforms that did the same to downplay something that we now know is the most dangerous thing in existence. I mean, that is a shocking thing to think about. 1994, the subtitle, despite a slew of reassuring newspaper stories about dioxin, scientific studies are finding that the chemical is even worse than once thought. So it says, imagine a family of toxic chemicals so widespread that no one can escape exposure. Industrial compounds that at low doses can disable the immune system, promote cancer and other diseases, and even cross the placental barrier to disrupt embryonic development. Now, consider that these chemicals are real and that the the EPA is releasing this summer a draft of a reassessment of their measurable effects, with results so worrisome that the agency is expected to recommend tight future controls on the chemicals. Now remember, a year later, we'll show you this discussion with CNN where they kicked the can down the road. Well, they were going super dangerous, but the chlorine companies were pushing back, so we have to do some more studies. And we know what happened. So what's important to highlight here is that even this point, it was already feigning action. The EPA was already going, no, but we have a better report that shows it's dangerous, but we have to, showing how long they've known about this and continued to either cover it up or been told to continue doing it. however you want to look at it, or allowing it rather. Given all that, it says the EPA's expected tough stance would seem to be reassuring news. Yet, convincing the public of a need for costly controls may not be easy. That's because during the past 3 years, newspapers and magazines around the country published numerous stories overlooking the science involved and discounting the danger of exposure to the most toxic substance in the group, specifically TCDD, commonly known as dioxin. So the point they're making is that even though this was coming out, there was corporate media that was sticking its finger into this and trying to downplay the risks. As far back as you want to look, I think that's the role that these platforms have played. Now it says, where have those stories come from? And who's right? The answers serve as a wake-up call to journalists and editors. You could change the way you read the newspaper. And could change the way you read the newspaper, which I think we're all there today. Nearly everyone living in industrialized society has been exposed to dioxin. It's important to think about because it's the truth. And we don't want to acknowledge that today, it seems. Until the summer of 1991, news stories generally referred to dioxin as the most dangerous of man-made chemicals. That's the case. And this again, so that's clear to point out that before this weird pushback, it was already pretty acknowledged how dangerous this was. Now it says its discovery, and this is an old story we've mentioned in the past that you can look up, it discovered dioxin, specifically TCDD, on local roads in Missouri. They completely closed down the town of Times Beach because of this. To think about the difference today. And this is a far smaller example of this problem compared to even East Palestine or the others. Now it says its detection in rivers and fish had been cause for alarm. When 1988 tests found dioxin in Florida's Fen Holloway, for example, activists posted a warning sign. And it says dioxin is no longer detectable in the water. In the laboratory, dioxin had induced cancer in animals at far smaller doses than any other cancer-causing chemical, and it had proved to be more than 11,000 times more potent than the deadly poison sodium cyanide in killing guinea pigs. Think about how crazy obvious. This is before they pushed back from the New York Times. Now it says then, on August 15, 1991, New York Times reporter Keith Schneider wrote a front-page story with the assertion that exposure to dioxin, quote, is now considered by some experts to be no more risky than spending a week sunbathing. Think about that. Now, again, remember, we know that's not true today. And even that's the ultimate point at the end of the article. So this guy came out and just, pushed this story. Now, you could argue he didn't know he was wrong, but the point is you get to the point where you can prove at the end that he did, but didn't follow up on it. So where did it come from? Is it as simple to point out that chlorine companies pushed them or influenced somebody to get? Certainly possible. But I want you to ask if it could be bigger than that, which is usually an indication when something like the New York Times comes out and pushes a completely false story. It says other papers ran their own similar reports and editorials that lambasted scientists for encouraging the government to waste money on dealing with dioxins. Now, this is the point of how the propaganda multiplier works. We've talked about that before. Let me see if I can get that to pop up. Yeah, doesn't look like it. I'll look at it later. I have a story, I think a clip we did where I discussed what's called the propaganda multiplier. And it simply talks about the groups like Reuters and AP and how they just dump out like newswire stuff. And then the corporate media just gobbles it up, puts it back out. Most of the time, they don't even look at it. They don't, half the time, they don't even point out that it came from them. And it just trickles down. And then from them, or like the New York Times runs something from them. And then the smaller platforms do it. And we see how that works today. And that's the point they make in this, that ultimately all these smaller papers, at least 20 major newspapers around the country, just reprinted the New York Times story, which shows you everything right there. It's a false story. We can prove that. And they just repeated it because they knew they could. Despite the flurry of attention, Schneider's conclusions about dioxin risk then and in other stories for nearly 3 years had a major flaw. They were wrong. Many experts in and outside of the federal government have said all along that there has been no scientific basis for suggesting that dioxin is less dangerous than previously thought. It says, quote, I don't think we have any indication right now that the risk would be lower than we believed, said William Farland, from one of the EPA officials in charge of the reassessment of dioxin in 1992. But Schneider continued to downplay dioxin's dangers and overlook research until a May 11th, 1994 story about an EPA reassessment. Now, again, this is a good point to make about why not every individual within these entities are always, I mean, who knows for sure? Maybe he was playing a role to keep it obfuscated, but usually you find the examples of EPA or CDC people that are more lower down that don't realize they're part of a corrupt organization. And that's who I'm speaking to when I talk about this. Say something. If you see a problem, speak up. Because I hope you start to realize that they're not in the interest of trying to find out the solution. You may be, so make a difference. Now it says Newsday's Earl Lane reported that the panel, which reviews drafts of the EPA reassessment of dioxin, which the only reason, like, why would even need the reassessment? Like, this is what's so funny about it, is that ultimately they already had the argument that it was bad. Then you get this random article from New York Times, which trickles through all the media, which triggers a reassessment. It just doesn't, it's the same thing as the fluoride dynamic. We don't need, why we get driven by propaganda, I guess here's the best way to put it. It shows you what drives the conversation, not the fact-based research that they've claimed they've done, but the propaganda that they respond to, which is exactly the point. But it says, the report, which reviewed drafts of the EPA reassessment of dioxin, had found, quote, that the chemical's effects may be broader and more troubling than previously thought, which is the truth. Schneider's September 26 story was also picked up by other newspapers, including the Kansas City Star, which put it on the front page under the headline, quote, scientists say dioxin is no big threat. Think about that. 4 days later, a correction acknowledged that the headline might have understated the potential effects of dioxin. So think about how crazy that is, that you can put that headline out and then quietly put out a retraction or a correction, and most people don't see that. All because the Kansas City Star did not have the wherewithal to recognize that they couldn't just blindly follow what the New York Times said, or didn't care. In 1982, the CDC found some of the highest levels of dioxin in the region in Times Beach, in Missouri. The federal government bought out the town's property owners, which, by the way, is another point to make. Maybe that was used then for a land grab. Certainly possible. More than 2,000 people moved, and the town closed down in early 1983 at a cost of approximately $30 million. So think about that kind of an action for something that was objectively smaller than East Palestine, and yet you don't even hear the word dioxin mentioned until they're forced to acknowledge it. Does that sound like a cover-up to you? It does to me. And the point is that we have to consider, like, I'm curious if you're out there and you have any more insight on this, right? What is there any more that we should know about Times Beach? Is there something the government did there after the fact? Let us know. Vernon Hook, or H-O-U-K is the name, I'll say Hook, then an assistant surgeon general at the CDC, was one of the federal officials who recommended the buyout. In May 1991, however, Hook had told a Columbia, Missouri conference on environmental health that he believed Times Beach residents never should have moved. This is very interesting, because one, you can show that he was aware of this before. Then something happened, some influence happened, and then he pushed back. Well, that was a mistake to make them move. But you'll see where this ends up. So what the common denominator here is that you can see a threat, and then somebody pulls a string and gets people in positions of power, or the New York Times, or somebody to push back on that and lie. Now, we know today that they were wrong, but so that's the point he makes earlier. Who did that? Who's pulling strings? Is it just your government? Is it a corporate? Is it a lobbyist group? I don't know. Somebody had the interest of trying to hide this then, just like they are now. And clearly they succeeded today. People don't even know what this is. And still, despite all this coverage. Now it says, who told the writer, told this writer, the person writing this article, in early 1993, that new research was showing dioxin to be, quote, not especially harmful to man. In April 1991, 1 month before Hook's speech, the EPA announced it would reevaluate dioxin's risks. Months later, on December 3rd, another New York Times reporter covering a lawsuit wrote that, quote, some experts now say that exposure to the chemical is no more risky than a week of tanning. And more than a year later, on October 14th, 1992, Financial Times reporter Peter Knight wrote that, quote, last year, a U.S. report described the danger from dioxins as no more harmful than a week of sunbathing. So it just trickles down. It says, quote, it was my metaphor, Schneider said in 1992 interview with the writer of this article. He says, quote, I still think it's absurd, says Richard Clapp, a professor at Boston University's School of Public Health, who has studied dioxin and other health risks. He says, even Hook, who recently retired from the CDC, said the analogy is inappropriate. So you get older, you retire, and you kind of walk it back. Something was driving this. While there is legitimate debate over the exact degree of risk of the risk dioxin poses, no scientists contend that dioxins are safe. Cancer is still a major concern, but even more troubling are new studies. This is 1994, showing other adverse effects. Researchers at the EPA and the university laboratories in several countries have found persuasive evidence in animals and humans that even tiny amounts of dioxin can skew critical chemical balances that are necessary for normal growth, especially in developing embryos. Even tiny amounts. So think about it from back to Catherine's point. So this is even more indiscernible. So you take a tiny release or something that nobody even notices. You have a chemical plant that burns, and then somehow within hundreds of miles around this area, anybody that was pregnant, embryos are suddenly in some way hurt. It skews the chemical balance that are necessary for normal growth. So that can very clearly amount to a reduction in lifespan for that embryo, for the woman holding them, for their children after that. So you can disregard that that's the connection. My point is simply to show how obvious it is that this continues to line up in that direction. And why no one wants to acknowledge this today. Even tiny amounts can have these effects. EPA's chief researcher on the dioxin reassessment, toxicologist Linda Birnbaum, explains that cells respond to dioxin as if it were a hormone, sending wrong messages. Funny how many things like that line up in the same direction. The confused cells keep dividing when they should stop, fail to grow when they should continue, or turn into different types of cells altogether. That sounds pretty crazy. Mutagenic. Dioxin is a very potent growth dysregulator, says this expert. She's a toxicologist. A Dutch study published in November 1993 found that infants exposed to dioxin from their mother's breast milk produced excess thyroid hormones, which could retard development of the central nervous system and cause psychomotor problems. 2 years earlier, the same group of researchers at the University of Amsterdam discovered a relationship between intracranial bleeding in newborn babies and high levels of dioxin exposure before birth. The researchers think the mothers were exposed to dioxin in much the same way everyone in industrialized countries are exposed primarily through contamination in food. Again, reiterating this article's from 1994. Now recognize this, which we'll come back to in a minute again, important study that shows you long-range air transport of dioxins from North American sources, that's Canada and the United States, into vulnerable receptors in Nunavut, Arctic Canada. And again, and by the way, I've been saying around 200 miles. The point is, in this study, the people in this location don't have a dioxin source, a prominent dioxin source within 200 miles. It's actually 313 miles. It's 500 kilometers. And the point is that despite having no serious dioxin sources within 313 miles, if I remember the exact number correctly, specifically 500 kilometers, they are still getting dangerous levels in their breast milk from North American sources. What about the people that live right next to these sources in North America? Guess we don't talk about that. That's crazy to me. And so that, where were we? Right here is what we're talking about, is that they're simply talking about low levels of this. And what these women who are having intracranial bleeding in newborn babies and high levels of dioxin exposure before birth are dealing with the same amount that everybody in industrialized countries are exposed to. You're beginning to see why they don't want to acknowledge this problem. I mean, this is talk about a class action lawsuit. This is earth shattering. It says in 1993, University of Heidelberg study reported that people who ingested high doses of dioxin in vegetables grown on contaminated soil suffered verbal and psychomotor problems, irritability, emotional instability. Kind of sounds like an autism overlap. Not to say that that's the same thing. My point is that these things get conflated. Children that are, just in some way suppressed like this, they just chalk it up to some kind of emotional behavioral problem. And this is where one huge overlap is coming from that nobody even talks about. You bring up dioxins to your doctor, they don't even know what you're talking about. The symptoms mirror cognitive deficits found in dioxin-exposed monkeys and other animals. See how obvious there's science that backs up the connection point to these being done and these exact byproducts to the levels that we experience right now, not even the big disasters. Other studies also find evidence that humans and study animals react to dioxins in similar ways. The EPA's Birnbaum points to an ongoing National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health study of workers exposed to high levels of dioxin. Men in that study and rats in other research show comparable decreases in levels of circulating testosterone in response to dioxin specifically. Increases in cancer found that the NIOSH, again, that's the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the study therein, are also very close to the rate of cancer among animals exposed to comparable levels of dioxins. What a coincidence. So we have the same comparable amounts. I wonder if it's because, I don't know, we're confronted with the same problem. Nah, that's crazy talk, Ryan. The obvious provable thing that we know is there is totally not causing the thing other studies show it can cause, because that'd be crazy conspiracy theory, right? It says in Taiwan, make sure I missed that last part. Yeah. In Taiwan, women who ate rice oil contaminated with PCBs or PCDFs, which is lower levels of the same problem, in 1979 gave birth to children who suffered developmental delays and growth retardation. Their IQs averaged 5 points below normal. Researchers are finding that many of the boys who are just reaching sexual maturity have abnormally small penises. This is exactly what we're talking about. Suppression of all sorts of things. And these are lower levels, guys. It says, and again, we're talking about rice contaminated. You have to realize 16 states across, you just got high levels of dioxins that are in the soil now. Now, that may not translate ultimately to very high levels in this food, but you are having some passover and it accumulates. So when you just have a generally, any number of the things to a lesser degree, the hormonal issues that cause all things we just discussed, or the mental issue of not being able to speak properly, not being able to, all of these things. Nobody would associate that with these problems. EPA's dioxin reassessment panel has concluded that the combined effects of all dioxin-like chemicals must be considered in evaluating dioxin's risk. So even that makes it even crazier, because we're talking about the lower level aspects, but also what they call dioxin-like chemicals, which are kind of in the same ballpark. And that's the point they make, is those are, when you do the assessment, those have to be included to find the full risk. So not only are they not talking about dioxins in general, but obviously then that means they're not including the other ones that are also supposed to be included when actually sussing out the risk. So do we think the EPA that refused to even acknowledge dioxins in East Palestine, once finally pointed to them, then actually broadened it out to? Of course not. Despite it coming from the EPA. Now it says, even the small amounts of these chemicals that most people have in their bodies may be enough to trigger developmental or immunological effects. Make sure you just heard that. In 1994, and this is all the source material, the links, it's all in this show. Even the small amounts that we all have in our bodies, or rather most people, I would argue it's pretty ubiquitous today, are enough to trigger developmental or immunological effects. According to Birnbaum, the current dietary intake of dioxin and closely related compounds may be, quote, very close to the danger zone in 1994. And remember, we just showed you it's been increasing ever since. And right now are markedly on the rise. And so they're saying back then, the current amount may be very close to the danger zone. So if that's the case, we're over that by now, without question. If current human levels are at or near the point where effects are occurring, that means we don't have any kind of margin of safety, especially now that we're beyond that point, right? And there certainly are people in the population who are way above that level. Wouldn't it seem like something Americans should know about? Especially from a group that claims to be looking out for your environmental protection? Quote, we've never said in the New York Times that dioxin is not dangerous, Schneider told a group of journalists last fall. So a couple years later, he's going, I didn't say that. Well, you did, though, and it's very easy to prove. He told this writer, the person writing this article in spring of 1993, that his conclusion in March 1993 was that, quote, new research indicates that dioxin may not be so dangerous after all. And that apparently only refers to dioxin cancer-causing potential, not other health effects. Quite the sidestep. So Just so it's clear, even in his follow-up, he has to admit that they are very dangerous and tries to dispute or differentiate between specific things. No, it was pretty clear they were saying not dangerous after all, not as bad as sunbathing. And it says, the article, however, fails to make that point. On May 11th, 1994, Schneider reported in the Times that he had obtained a draft of the EPA reassessment. And for the first time, he detailed studies showing dioxin's effects on developing embryos and on the immune and reproductive systems. So for years, many people went along with this not being a problem because they said so in the New York Times. Now here's the same writer admitting that there is a problem. It says, but as for cancer, and this is crazy, he wrote that the draft called into question dioxin's reputation as a deadly killer of people. According to Lynn Goldman, EPA Assistant Administrator for Prevention, Pesticides and Toxic Substances, nothing in the draft supported that observation. So even after this, they're still trying to kind of sidestep some of these problems. So something is driving this. Why would these random people have this interest in trying to hide the facts? It says it's not in there, she said in May. The report reaffirms that dioxin is a probable cause of cancer in humans. Now it says whether or not its cancer risk is less than once thought, according to CDC health scientist Mark McClanahan, dioxin is the most potent cancer-causing chemical ever tested. That's from a CDC health scientist in 1994. I'm willing to bet you won't hear that from them today. It is the most potent cancer-causing chemical ever tested, at least in 1994. It is thousands, he says, of times more powerful than most other chemicals that cause cancers in animals. Even the lowest cancer risk estimates for rats suggested by industry studies rate dioxin, get this, nearly 2 million times stronger than benzene. One of a handful of known human carcinogens, 2 million times more dangerous in a cancer-causing sense, according to a CDC health scientist. But we're all crazy, right? Vernon Hook, whose views on dioxin to have been controversial since the early 1980s when the CDC began investigating Agent Orange health claims, once wrote that dioxin, again, I argue that was a test, both a use of a chemical weapon for their own purposes under the guise of removing foliage, but then also wanting to know what it did. So that's, your government has done this at every opportunity, it seems, if you look back in history, to you as well. But it says they wrote that dioxin, quote, may be without consequence, even in very high dose exposure to humans. And you know why? Because that's not what they found. We can prove what actually happened to people that suffered this in Vietnam. They did this because they had just used it on a bunch of civilians. That's my opinion, obviously, but my point is you can prove that wasn't the case now. Now it says during a 1990 congressional investigation, Hook acknowledged under oath that he had written those words in a letter urging Canada to relax dioxin standards. Why? Who drove him to do that? Now it says he is now too ill for interviews. But he told this writer last year, quote, no one in their right mind would make that statement. I clearly believe that dioxin is harmful at high levels, and it is at every level, guys. But think about that shift. So what? He's dying, and now he changes his tune. Who was driving this? That's very important to think about. Hook's views apparently were the basis for a New York Times editorial claiming that, quote, federal officials now believe they have overreacted in setting extremely low exposure limits for dioxins and in prematurely evacuating all the residents of Times Beach. All of that's fake, and we know that for a fact today. Not fake, but incorrect. But my point is that even after this, they were still going back and forth trying to downplay the information. This is ongoing to today, as far as I can tell. Now it says, he has also shaken the reporting community. And this is another point is that they've today, Schneider admits that they made a mistake. Now it says in the same newsletter, USA Today, environmental editor Ray Tyson pointed out that healthy skepticism has always been a part of good journalism. It's like saying 1 + 1 = 2. It's like obviously objectivity, but it says, but he wrote, quote, I think Schneider messed up. Oh, this the quote. It's hold on. Let me read it all the way through. And not because he questioned a time-honored premise, but because he relied on some questionable science to prove his point. Therein lies a lesson for all who strive to understand the real environmental hazards of our world. So maybe the dioxin confusion, that's a very generous word right there, can serve a purpose after all for journalists and readers alike, to recognize how easy it is to be misled by fake information in the media. Now, I guess I didn't grab it. The point is you could read through this because we obviously know that wasn't true today. That's a fact. You can prove it. That in this, as you even saw one already, Schneider essentially walks this back as the continues to talk about this. So here is the CNN article 1 year later. Okay, despite all of that, here's what CNN reported in 1995. Dioxins may be creating a larger problem down the road. And the point again is to show that dioxins become airborne and travel thousands of miles away. So whether it's Bakersfield, whether it is East Palestine or Conyers, Georgia, that's what's happening with things just like this. That's easily proven. It's not true because CNN said so. It's true because it is true. And that today they wouldn't say it. I mean, they have this background. They know it's there. Why aren't they saying it today? Same reason the New York Times tried to lie about it, in my opinion. Now it says a Big Mac or Pizza Hut personal pan pizza or 3 pieces of Kentucky chicken gave us about 8 to 150 times more dioxins than the EPA feels would be safe. Now, we just went over those levels. 8 times what we're talking about with all we just saw is shocking, but 150 times the safe level? Well, we just read what that can do. That's crazy to me. And that's in the food you're eating. Back in 1995. And the point is, he goes on to highlight the restaurants can't help it. Dioxins have had years to build up in the food chain. Yeah, that's what we just pointed out. And I just made clear they know about that. And they've just done nothing to stop it. That's why the EPA wants to change the standards, but they did not, as far as I can tell. It says, it recently said even lower levels of dioxins can hurt us by weakening our immunities or attacking our reproductive system. But even though they just said that, even in this report, it says the EPA's review board thinks that they might be too restrictive. Think about that. As we're acknowledging the problems, we're going, but well, we don't want to restrict it too much. Clearly, they care about your health. Now, there's more. Read this whole interview. I've gone over it many times. One of the main points at the end is simply the idea that they highlight that, well, the chlorine companies push back. Where it says, right here, it says, and the chlorine industry believes that each one should be tested and judged separately. Right. So we recognize from an industry standpoint, or rather an institution standpoint, your only job being the environmental protection and health. And you find a problem that is acutely dangerous, you can prove it, and you bow to the corporate interests that say, well, let's test them individually and come down to, well, there's logic to that you should just, but the point is, it's not about individual products, it's about chlorine, which they knew then. And guess what? Because they pushed back and bowed to corporate interest, nothing happened. As we can see today, it's getting markedly worse. Now, last few points, it's important for us to remember what Stephen Lester said over a year ago about East Palestine. Here's the real reason the EPA doesn't want to test for toxins, specifically dioxins, in East Palestine. He says it's well documented that burning chlorinated chemicals like vinyl chloride or just chlorine will generate dioxins. Quote, dioxin is the name given to a group of persistent, very toxic chemicals that share similar chemical structures. The most toxic form of dioxin, 2378, or I'll just say TCDD because that's a hard one to pronounce. TCDD is more commonly recognized as the toxic contaminant found in Agent Orange, Love Canal, New York, and Times Beach, Missouri, both sites of 2 of the most tragic environmental catastrophes in the U.S. And realize, again, you can prove that some of these locations are objectively smaller than what we're talking about today. So there is a willful disregard right there, a willful ignorance. It says dioxin is, even in The Guardian, this guy's writing about it during East Palestine, saying they know it and they're ignoring it. And this guy is an expert. This is what he does. We've talked about the past, him testing. Now it says dioxin is not deliberately manufactured. Well, that's generally speaking, but I would argue they've done this in the past for weapons, which we've already proven. They've used this to try to kill a president in Ukraine in the past. It is the unintended byproduct of industrial processes that use or burn chlorine. That's by and large, right? 80% of which come from specifically G20 countries, most of which comes from the United States and Canada, as far as I understand it. And the point is that this is all something that we could ultimately stop. Now, it says the organization I work for, he writes, this is Stephen, the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, has worked with communities affected by dioxins for over 40 years. We have seen the impact of exposure to dioxins in communities from Love Canal to Times Beach to Pensacola, Florida. And now We are asking, why isn't EPA testing for dioxins in East Palestine? And then this is the date, March 2nd. And he says, are dioxins present in the soil downwind from the site of the accident? Well, yeah, we know that now. Yes, 100%. He says, one person who lived 15 miles away described burned ash material from the fire that settled on her property. Again, 16 states across, we now know. Another who lived 3 miles away described how the black cloud completely smothered his property. These are important questions that deserve to be answered. When it's just simply saying what's going on with farm animals and so on, kids playing. Today, there are no clear answers, which is wild. Still, by the way. He says, why? He answers his question, because no one has done any testing for dioxins anywhere in East Palestine, which eventually they at least claimed they did. The numbers they showed were embarrassingly small compared to what every independent expert found. So I argue they either didn't or manipulated it. But at this point, they hadn't, which is wild to think about because they knew it was there and didn't, which makes my point. And he's backing that up. And he says, no one is testing for dioxins in East Palestine. No one. And it seems that the EPA is uninterested in testing for dioxins, behaving as though dioxin is no big deal. No, I argue they were pretending it didn't exist, acting like they didn't even know what it was, telling the doctors, the hospital to not give them those tests. This makes no sense, he writes. Testing for dioxin, a highly toxic substance, should have been one of the first things to look for, especially in the air once the decision was made to burn vinyl chloride. But let's remember, that wasn't how that worked. It wasn't a controlled burn. It wasn't a decision. It was a railroading, no pun intended, of the local fire chief. As he said himself, as we'll highlight with this article, investigation found East Palestine, quote, controlled burn was unnecessary, that Norfolk lied. Alan Shaw himself, in this court proceeding, it came out that his expert admitted this was treated vinyl chloride and most likely would not explode. And then they told the fire chief everything but that, and then pressured him to make a rapid decision without knowing that, which ultimately decided to blow it up. And that gained, I think that was exactly what they wanted. Either way, as I just showed yesterday, they're like, we've got 49 new people working with us, so you were doing great. Seems like they benefited in the long run, which blows my mind. Either way, whatever you think about how it went down, the point was that this was a deliberate choice that didn't need to happen, whether it was for greed or some other larger cover-up. So as he's talking about this, that says that the air decision was made to burn the vinyl chloride. That didn't have to happen. And that is where the disaster truly came from. It says there is no question that dioxins were formed in the vinyl chloride fire. No question. That's my point. You have to realize how undeniable that is. That's why I'm saying it about the other. When you burn chlorine in the fire, there's not a question of if, it's about how much. That's what Scott is saying as well. And so they chose to pretend it wasn't there. Now it says they would have formed on that particulate matter, the black soot, in the cloud that was so clearly visible at the time of the burn. Now the question is how much is in the soil where people live in and around East Palestine, which they're not talking about today. That was the soil they were shipping all over the country. Without testing, no one will know, and the people who live there will remain in the dark, uncertain about their fate. Now, I'll grab these really quickly for you as well. Or at least just this one. I don't want to have to search for the rest of them. Because this is an important one. Again, doing my due diligence and actually calling these places, I referenced it earlier, have them on the phone, on the record. All the links are in there. You can download it for yourself, which I speak to Clean Harbors. And this is entitled The Clean Harbors Waste Disposal Ohio Scandal. And they admit on the record that they did not have what was necessary for what we knew was there. So they spread this all over the place. Whether it's, and even Scott alluded to Clean Harbors being some sort of central part in some larger manipulation. Now it says, it is important because of the adverse health effects associated with exposure to dioxins, which he knows about, and they do too. Exposure to dioxins can cause cancer, reproductive damage, developmental problems, type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, infertility in adults, impairment in the immune system, and skin lesions. The EPA is very familiar with dioxins. For more than 25 years, the agency evaluated and assessed and then reassessed the risks posed by exposure to dioxins, but somehow don't know about it today. They published multiple draft reports on the health effects caused by exposure to dioxins. They published an inventory of dioxin sources and devoted an enormous amount of time to studying dioxins. The agency knows this chemical very well, but yet somehow didn't know to bring it up? Hardly. There's no way in my mind to overlook this, guys. It was a willful choice to keep it from the discussion. So that doesn't have to mean they didn't do it. Maybe they were trying to solve it. I don't think that, but who knows? Maybe behind the scenes, they were doing everything they could, but it still means they lied to you about it. Didn't let you make your choices to keep your family safe. That's really important to understand. It says, so why is EPA unwilling to test for dioxins in the soil? He says, this is exactly what I think. My guess, he says, is because they know they will find it. And if they find it, they'll have to address the many questions people are asking. Largely, how did this start? Why didn't you do anything before? Why haven't you been telling? And of course, when you dig into this, you find everything we're talking about. Wait a minute. Here's a study you're talking about this 20 years ago. Why wasn't this the first thing you brought up? Uh-oh. See how this cascading problem begins? Suddenly you find out the government has been doing things that they know produce it and not telling you, covering things up, hiding disasters, not bringing it up when we know it's a problem. There's something much bigger here. He says the people who live there in this East Palestine, but same with Conyers and Bakersfield and wherever else, need to know so they can make informed decisions about their future for the safety of their families. But if you think for 1 second the government is more concerned about your child's safety over their agenda, I don't know what country you think you're living in. Frankly, I don't know what government in the world you think you're living under because they're all the same in my opinion. But I'll end here with, again, the reality that we know that from East Palestine, it went 16 states across. So when you're looking at pictures like this, which was, look at how far this goes. This is from Really Graceful's clip. Look at that smoke, guys. That's from Conyers, Georgia. Look at how far that is, how long this, again, as Scott was saying, this very well could be the worst in history. I really, really hope it's not the case. I just want people in these locations to be able to make their own decisions and not hope. Look at this. Look at the info. Look at that. That is so wild. Lastly, I'll include a clip that Jason just put up for us on Twitter about Georgia. And it's the clip that we went over from that last show about the prolonged illness that's continuing, which does, I think you might even be able to see it in here. If it shows it really quickly, maybe not. I was hoping that it caught the image of the woman with her rash. It's in there. You can watch it for yourself. Just showing you exactly what we're seeing. All the signs, all the telltale signs of a real problem are there. Analyze and optimize, an account that I'm not familiar with. I just saw this today looking through for stuff online. It says, and this is from September 2024. Obesity causing chemicals in the environment. BPA, PFAS, I think it's what was it again? Phthalates, or is it phthalates? I forget the PHTALATEs, parabens, MSG, glyphosate, atrazine, PBCs, DDT, particulate matter, PAH. We just talked about PBDEs, dioxins, and more. They say it's not just the food. The point is simply to highlight this stuff is everywhere. It's not just the one thing. This is what, as Catherine points to, is the great poisoning. There's something very clear, and it's bigger than just one thing. Now, look, I hope, like with the fluoride point, even if it's a byproduct of the worst thing that we still need to point out and fight against, I hope that RFK Jr. has an effect on this. We all should, no matter how this goes, because that's a positive net effect. Now, before the lesser of evils ploy, my point's the same. Even with that net, I still wouldn't argue you lean into something you don't want. That's a game. That's a ploy. You're being tricked. But now that we're here, and again, you know my point, I don't think any of that translated the way you think it did. I think it's all a game. Doesn't have to be in a real representative government, but today, I think that's where we are. The point is that now, yes, we should hope for any positive benefit, but very much be on guard for how that could hide larger things from you. Now, I'm going to get more into that in the coming shows and continue to follow up on the people that are being put in position and the foreign policy dynamic. But I really do think this is important for us to highlight for much larger reasons. Natural Immunity FTW writes, organic and non-organic aren't good enough anymore. We need a food testing program that tests for PFAS, phthalates, PCBs, dioxins, heavy metals. All this stuff. Not run by the government. Thank you. I don't care whether it's the government you like. It's still the government, guys. And it's amazing that we have to even make that point today. How we've digressed so many ways. We need to make sure that this is not done by the same entity that might be influenced by lobbyists or their own personal interests or whatever else, which is always where we end up. The point is that I'm glad to see that more people are beginning to come away, like addressing whether it's seed oils, start there, go ahead, but dive into how dangerous and obvious and almost willful this all seems to be. And I'll end with this point, which I just think is absurd. Same point we just made about the other McDonald's thing. Comrade Misty simply says, make America healthy again. Effing clown, SHIT. And this is Donald Trump and Elon Musk. And I'm just on a side point. Is it just me, or is almost everything I keep seeing with RFK Jr. with this group, it's like he's like a hostage? Look at his face on these things, on all of them. It looks like he's like there against his will almost. I mean, it's just the way his face looks. It seems strange. But here they are on a plane eating McDonald's. And RFK's face seems pained. I don't know why Mike Johnson is there, but the point is that they're all eating McDonald's, and clearly, yeah, good. No one's saying you can't go out and get bad food, okay? No one is saying that. But if we're really pushing this idea that you're trying to make America healthy again and lean, I can eat plenty of bad things, and I would never touch that stuff. When I was younger, sure. But we have to realize how shockingly bad these things are for you, whether it's the hormones, whether it's the seed oils, whether there's God knows what else, microplastics. These things are really bad for you. And look, my point is not that, yeah, we maybe make it better. Fine. How about we just get rid of those things? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be allowed to exist, be there, but don't allow these things to be leaned into by the government, like Trump during COVID-19, because there's a point there about how that's being overlapped. Let the market decide. And yeah, these things will still exist, obviously. But the point is that what we're leaning into is constantly showing the wrong direction. I just want you to stand back and think about whether it's a small point or not, the reality of whether this is truly direction. Now, maybe RFK wants the right direction, but do the rest of them, is that going to be allowed to happen? We have yet to see. Nothing has truly happened yet until we see these positions start and what it really looks like, and whether RFK is given some data and they, whatever the game is played. Just because Trump doubled down on the HHS doesn't mean it has happened yet. So let's wait and see and hold our judgment. And really, the main point at the end is that even those that support this administration, we're past the election fervor, the psychotic nature of these election processes. Now they're there. So this game where we act like we have to hold back criticism because it might make why is that still happening? Because you know what it shows you? That they don't care about the truth. They're arguing that anything bad against him, we have to hide or push back on because it hurts what? They're in power already. Anybody honest who actually cares about the good of the country and not just team sport politics would be holding them to account more than anybody, because that's how it's supposed to work. Even the ones that you believe in should be held to a higher standard. So when you see them continually taking bad steps, call it out, which a lot of Republicans and conservatives are starting to do. Thank God. So we will follow up more. Graveyard Pirate said, in my opinion, there is zero chance this wasn't a planned photo op to inspire a response, and they knew 100% what that response would be. He says this is nothing short of mocking their supporters. They will be mocking you all the way to the Biomet Digital ID, CBDC. I happen to agree, but please decide for yourself. So I think it's important that we take time to really try to break this stuff down, and don't take my opinions on this stuff. I mean, I'm basing it on what I believe the research shows, but the core point is just that it's happening, that we know that. From East Palestine to Georgia to Bakersfield, or any number of other examples we've already talked about. Richmond, I think, was one as well. These things are provable dioxin releases. Now, just a small amount, as we already highlighted, is very dangerous. The fact that they're not even willing to acknowledge that, let alone test for it. And again, actually going back to what Scott said in the beginning, remember, this is now happening now in Georgia. He's saying, again, they're refusing to test for what we know as a fact was released. And really, more of a provable example than anything I've ever seen. More than Seveso, more than East Palestine, literal chlorine burned in a plant. With plastic, everything about this is a perfect storm for one of the most, potentially the worst we've seen. But at the very least, is still a problem that should be addressed, and no one's even talking about that. And now they're refusing to do it yet again. I think there's something very, very dark happening here. But all I want you guys to see is that this is a problem that needs to be acknowledged so we can deal with it. It's as simple as that. The rest of it, you can decide for yourselves, but don't jump to conclusions. We need to wait for facts to prove this. But in my opinion, right now, there's enough on the table, aside from whatever larger conspiracy may be driving what you think is happening or what is driving it. Right now, we can see enough. These people should be in charge. There should be accountability right now for what they've allowed to happen. The willful disregard of the health in just these 3 locations. That's enough right now to hold somebody accountable. But typically we tend to look for the bigger story, which we should, but let's not miss the forest for the trees. Right here, this needs to be solved. So hopefully we can get this momentum going, reach out to people, talk about it, make some clips, tag me in it. I'll share it myself. So thank you for tuning in today, guys. I appreciate your time and your support. We need your support as always. There's more coming our way with all that's coming on. I believe I've got my first date here coming up next month, which is going to, lawsuit stuff, and it's going to be overwhelmingly frustrating. But that aside, I mean, honestly, I hate even bringing that. The point is that if you believe in what we're doing, what I do on this show, what Derek writes about, even in the connective points, Whitney and Derek and everybody else in their own plan. Well, if you believe in what the IMA is doing, if you believe in what we're trying to do here, support all of us. Support TLAV, support the people that you think are acting from an honest place, even if they make mistakes, which we all do if we're honest. But support the people that you think are actually trying to build the world that you want, not just pointing at things and taking different steps. So I think it's an important time not to choose sides as much as that's always happening, but to acknowledge what you can prove and support the people that seem to be acting with good intention, not just acting in agenda in the interest of the larger political game. So thank you for tuning in. I love you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.